Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. Today's episode has got me caught up on names. I've wasted an inordinate amount of time reading about naming conventions, looking for a particular fact, and failing to find it. I've picked up a bunch of other interesting factoids along the way. For example, did you know that the Age of Reason and the corresponding move away from an overtly religious society corresponds almost exactly with the rise of floral names for women? An article by Neil Burtis points out that, at least in the Anglosphere, names like Daisy, Hazel, Holly, Ivy, Lily, Marigold, Poppy, and Rose all came into prominence at the exact same time in the early 1800s. This was a move away from biblical names like Mary and Elizabeth, which, along with Anne, accounted for fully half of all girls' names in 1700. In that same year, John, William, and Thomas accounted for half of all boys' names in England. And it's one of those that's been nagging at me. Thomas. I've been trying to figure out why it was such a popular name in the 1600s. I mean, I've got nothing against the name Thomas, and I understand that it's a biblical name. Thomas was one of the apostles, but that doesn't account for how often it seems to pop up. But in the coming weeks, we are going to be inundated with Thomases. It's a plague of Thomases. If it were simply a biblical thing, or even an apostle thing, then why are there no significant famous pirates named Matthew? I mean, we've got two Bartholomews. We've got Bartholomew Sharp and Black Bart Roberts, but we've got no Black Matt. Although I should note that Bartholomew Roberts was really named John, and he took up the name Bartholomew maybe in reference to Bartholomew Sharp. But why are there so many pirates named Thomas? This question sat there in the back of my mind, unnoticed, unimportant, but growing. It started nagging at me little by little every time I came across another pirate named Thomas, or a governor named Thomas, or a nobleman named Thomas. They're just everywhere. So I began to dig. But despite all the digging, I couldn't find a reasonable solution. There was no King Thomas. There were no noblemen named Thomas of any particular significance at the time. There were, however, priests named Thomas. Thomas à Becket has a special significance to the English people, and then there are the super famous priests like Thomas Aquinas. But I also discovered that for a long, long time, Thomas wasn't even really a name. Thomas the Apostle wasn't even really named Thomas. His name was Judas, but since there were already two Judases in that group of apostles, Jesus decided to call this one the Aramaic word for twin, which is actually how the name survived. It was in the monasteries in the late Imperial Roman era and the post-Imperial Dark Ages, when a monastery had too many men with the same name, they chose to follow Christ's lead and called one of the men Thomas. So I realize that these are the ravings of a lunatic mind who's been stuck in quarantine for too long. But there are a lot of Thomases with which we will be concerned moving forward. It's enough that it is kind of weird. Which really, I suppose, is kind of fitting. If Thomas means twin, it makes sense that we have so many of them all at once. And happily, for our narrative flow, all of them are New England stories, or at least they have their roots in North America. Their stories, as we will see, rove all over the world. This is episode 162, What's in a Name? As this is a North American story at its heart, it might be sensible to begin with the origins of the word Yankee. Oh, you thought we were done with the etymological nomenclature? Well, buckle up, buckaroo. Nobody, linguists I mean, conclusively agrees where the word Yankee, Y-A-N-K-E-E, comes from. No one in America can really agree what it even means. In its broadest sense, it just means an American. But that's something you'll hear mostly from people outside the U.S. In old World War II movies, you might hear the Brits talk about the Yanks. But inside the U.S., well, if you're visiting, which you shouldn't be doing right now, but if you are, I recommend that you don't call someone from Texas or South Carolina a Yankee. Back in our Civil War, Yankee was a term used to denote Union soldiers from the North. But if we go back even further, to the American Revolution, Yankee was a term for men from the northern colonies, or states at that point. Not necessarily New England, although today Yankee is often used to refer to New Englanders, but it included other states like Delaware and New Jersey, and New York. Of course, one of New York City's most famous institutions is the Yankees, one of their baseball teams. Now, however you choose to use the word Yankee, keep on keeping on, nobody's here to stop you. But historically, I think, most of the evidence points to Yankee being a nickname for New Yorkers. Mostly because it probably derived not from an English word, but a Dutch name. That name is the Dutch variant of John, the name Jan, Jan. It intersects with our story in the person of Jan Willems, alias Yankee. David F. Marley points out in Pirates of the Americas, quote, Willems appears to have called himself Jantje, a diminutive form of Jan, traditionally associated with Dutch sailors, much as Jack was among the English. However, this nickname was most often rendered Yankee, Janke, by other nationalities he came into contact with. End quote. And you'll note that all of those names begin with the letter J. But J itself has a strange history. It's, in English, our newest letter. It only came into common use in the 1600s. Before that time, the letter I was used, but it had kind of a Y or ya sound. Even in some of the older texts I deal with, you'll see John spelled I-O-N. It took me a while to figure out that Ion Coxon and Ion Cook were the same man as John Coxon and John Cook. That quirk of spelling and pronunciation really makes all of this fit, though. Jan Willems was called Yankee, but when the English encountered that troublesome little J, they used their corresponding English Y. Now, I'm no linguist here, but I mean, come on, here's a Dutchman named Yankee who sailed out of New England almost exclusively with English pirates. And the evidence there might be stronger if we could prove that Jan Willems was born in New Netherland, or even that he lived there. But we can't. We can, though, conclusively say that he began his piratical career sailing out of Rhode Island alongside an Englishman named Thomas. And as this Thomas is our first buccaneer from North America, I'd like to spend some time talking about Thomas Paine. Now, we shouldn't confuse him with the Enlightenment-era philosopher who wrote The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason. The pirate, Thomas Paine, was born in London in 1632. His father, also named Thomas Paine, died less than a year after he was born. His mother, though, Jane Gallion, remarried. She married a wealthy and influential Puritan based out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a man named Thomas Mayhew. You see what I'm getting at with the Thomases here? And oh, we're not done. Mayhew married Jane while he was in London to get a license to purchase some real estate. At the time, it may have seemed like relatively inconsequential real estate, but today it's some of the most august real estate in North America. He was there to purchase Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket Island, and the Elizabeth Islands. Thomas Mayhew and Jane Gallion had 4 daughters together. including an Elizabeth and a daughter named Martha, after whom Martha's Vineyard is named. That Martha Mayhew, was Thomas Paine's half-sister. Not only that, and this is true here, Martha Mayhew is Taylor Swift's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. Thomas Paine, a pirate, is her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-uncle, which is about how distantly I am related to Benjamin Franklin, who, as it happens, is the grandson of Thomas Mayhew's factor and personal assistant. What I'm saying is, Taylor, if you're listening, and I'm sure you are, I am your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's assistant's grandson's, I want to say like second cousin 6 or 7 times removed.
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing.
My point through all of this is that Thomas Paine, notorious pirate, had very deep roots in colonial America. He's often credited as having been born on Martha's Vineyard. And while that's not true, he did grow up there from the 1630s on. A ton of the colonial bigwigs we've met so far, we're talking governors and landowners who owned territories, well, they were present at the estate of Thomas Mayhew on more than one occasion. Thomas Paine probably met them as a young man. However, young Thomas Paine earned his sea legs in 1647, at the age of 15, on one of his stepfather's whaling ships. A few years later, in 1656, he probably first encountered the West Indies, on a merchant voyage on another one of his stepfather's ships, down to Jamaica. This was among the very first merchant voyages to the island after the capture in 1655. It was encouraged by none other than Oliver Cromwell. But we should remember that Thomas Paine was a stepson in the 17th century. He was housed and fed and educated by a prominent man in a prominent patrician family. He went to church with them on Sundays, but I doubt he was ever really included as part of the family. I'm sure his mother loved him, but by 15 he was sent to work at sea, far away, and out of sight. He was never going to inherit any land or money or influence from his stepfather. When Thomas Mayhew's eldest son died, Thomas Paine wasn't even considered to inherit the family business. Instead, Mayhew chose his grandson, who was an infant at the time. And we shouldn't feel sorry for Thomas Paine here. This isn't some fairy tale about an evil stepfather, that's just how it was. But it was about to get even harder. In 1660, Charles II was restored, and all of those old Puritan parliamentarian commissions were put under scrutiny. The business for a Puritan like Thomas Mayhew was put on hold, or at least severely scaled back, while the ownership rights for Mayhew's holdings were reviewed. Those rights would eventually be secured by the Mayhew family, but that would take over a decade. And we don't know what Thomas Paine was up to during this period, but we know that he wasn't working for his stepfather. It's possible, although unsubstantiated, that he might have taken part in some of those raids we mentioned last time, those attacks against royalist ships that just happened to disappear with nary a trace, the attacks that pressured King Charles to leave Massachusetts alone and allowed men like Thomas Mayhew to keep their land. We also don't know if he signed on with a privateership in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, but it's very likely that he did. We do know that in 1666, his mother died, and all ties between Thomas Paine and the Massachusetts set were severed. Again, I'm sure that was tragic and sorrowful, but by that point, Thomas Paine was a grown man. He was 34. He was an experienced, seasoned mariner. The next few years, though, are similarly mysterious in the life of Thomas Paine. The legends are expansive, though. Some of them may even be true. There are those that would suggest that Thomas Paine sailed alongside no less notorious pirates than Francois l'Olonnais or Admiral Henry Morgan. And, maybe. Some say that Thomas Paine even took part in the sack of Panama in 1671. We do know that he wasn't captain of a ship on that voyage. We know the captain's names. But he could have been a crewman. There were a lot of Brethren of the Coast at Panama. And why not? Paine was set adrift in 1666 from all his familial ties. There was money and opportunity and adventure down south. In fact, I would say it's even likely that Thomas Paine sailed with the Brethren. Maybe not with Morgan himself, but with someone. Maybe Pierre Le Picard or Roque Brasiliano. Maybe he sailed with Charles Swan. We do know that Thomas Paine served as a privateer in the Franco-Dutch War, beginning in 1672. He did so under English colors as part of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. But in 1674, the English pulled out of the war. They ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which was a tricky situation in the West Indies. Jamaica and Saint-Domingue were close allies. They were the only non-Spanish settlements in a sea of Spanish territory. Both Port Royal and Tortuga were surrounded by Spanish waters and Spanish lands. They shared a national, royal, colonial alliance against Spain. And for the Brethren of the Coast that lived in Port Royal and Tortuga, it was a real conundrum. Their entire system was built around their friendship and their shared enmity of Spain. It's not like the Spanish were just going to up and forget about all of the murder and rape and torture and burning and the theft just because the English pulled out of the war. So the English Buccaneers, who were in that tricky situation, switched over to French colors. This was done on the auspices of the governor of Saint-Domingue named Bertrand d'Aigrun. He was the governor that moved the capital of Saint-Domingue from Tortuga, which was never really an official capital, but he moved it down to Petit Goave in the southwest, which was a tactically solid move. Petit Goave lies on the north coast of that long peninsula in southwest Haiti. Any Spanish fleet that was attempting to reach them would have to sail around the peninsula and past all of the forts that were being built on it. If they were attempting to ride to Petit Goave, they would have to surmount those forts on land. The other option was to sail around the northwest corner, but that would take them past Tortuga, which... no. D'Aigrun, though, wasn't really a governor of Saint-Domingue. Really, he was an agent of the ill-fated and short-lived French West India Company. It's D'Aigrun that began Tortuga's policy of handing out letters of marque to anyone who asked for them, including foreign privateers. This policy, combined with the end of the Anglo-Dutch War, led to a mass exodus of privateers from their national service to French colors, and it was shortly going to cause real problems for the English. But the list of privateers that signed up to continue fighting in the Franco-Dutch War on the side of France, well, it's all of the most notable pirates in the era. All of those that sailed in the first Pacific adventure did so with letters of marque from Bertrand d'Aigrun, John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, John Cook, Edward Davis, all of William Dampier's friends. But back in the West Indies, d'Aigrun gave commissions to a bunch of Dutch buccaneers. Lauro de Graaf, Michael Andrezu, Nicholas van Horn, and most notable today, Jan Willems. Only a few English buccaneers stayed on or around Tortuga in this period. Notable on that list are George Wright and Thomas Paine. Now, we don't know where George Wright is from, presumably originally from England, but he could very well be a Boston man, or maybe from Providence. We don't know. He wasn't related to one of the richest men in the colonies, so no one wrote it down. We do know a bit about him, though. There's a letter, an unsent letter, from Henry Morgan to George Wright. It was probably transcribed, since Morgan never learned to read and write, but it spoke to write very familiarly. It tried to talk him out of his French service. Serving a foreign prince was not illegal for Englishmen, but it was frowned upon, and it would be outlawed before long. That letter, though, talked about the treacherous nature of the French, as they both knew very well. It suggests that Wright may have been a companion of Henry Morgan's. Even, it says to me, he may have been present on Henry Morgan's 1666 raid against Maracaibo. That's the raid on which the French and English forces had a falling out over the allocation of beef that ended in one death and very nearly in a pirate battle there on the beach. I mean, it's not unthinkable that Thomas Paine was there as well. That was the year his mother died, but maybe he didn't know about it because he was busy murdering Spaniards and looting their houses at the time. But we don't have a lot about either Englishman during the latter years of the war. We do know a bit. For example, Thomas Paine was noted in a report about another English freebooter, a man named Captain John Bennet. We know that he served John Bennet, but we don't know his rank. However, we can assume that he was an officer, quartermaster, maybe. We can assume that because in 1675, when Bennet captured a Spanish prize, he gave it to Thomas Paine. This was Paine's first acknowledged command as a privateer. He christened his new vessel, which he would sail for many years, St. David. And then again we lose track of him. But a little over a year later, Bertrand d'Ailgrand, the governor in Petit Goave, died, and Saint-Domingue had a new man installed. His name was Monsieur de Cousset, Sieur de Ponquet. And the Sieur de Ponquet is our best source for all of this. There are, of course, copious records from the Spanish about the attacks, but while they give us great details about the raids, they don't give us unbiased accounts of the pirates. You know, the real men. I mean, if you were robbed and tortured at the point of a musket, would you really care about this man's complex childhood? No, they were all bloodthirsty monsters. So the best picture we have about the earlier lives of most of these men, Thomas Paine notwithstanding, comes from the Sieur de Ponquet. He was an actual governor, a real governor, sent from the court of Louis XIV to command Saint-Domingue. His job there was twofold. First, and most importantly above all else, win the war. Second, though, in order to achieve the first goal, he had to figure out what d'Ailgrand had been up to. I think we can ascribe to the fact that he was a royally appointed governor that he wrote down everything. So everyone take a moment and thank Monsieur de Cousset, the Sieur de Ponquet. He spelled out the situation in Saint-Domingue for the crown. He reported on the pirate lord that ruled the Brethren of the Coast and Tortuga, a buccaneer of ill repute named Michel de Gramont. Gramont was a known factor back in France. He was a minor nobleman, the son of a minor nobleman, and a chevalier, a knight. He still held that title as it happened, but he was exiled as a young man for a murder of passion. But now that Henry Morgan had gone straight, Michel de Gramont was kind of the top-ranking buccaneer in the West Indies. The governor talks about him at length, but he also gives us an account of the buccaneers that his predecessor, Bertrand d'Ailgrand, had given letters of marque. Some of those letters of marque the new governor elected to revoke. That included all of the Englishmen in the Pacific, but some he chose to give new commissions. That lot included Lauro de Graaf and his fleet. They were all very closely tied to Monsieur de Cousset and to Saint-Domingue in general. But in the interest of winning the war, he included a few others who were less closely tied to Petit Goave and closer to Tortuga: Jan Willems, Thomas Paine, and George Wright. And this is actually our first ever historical note of Jan Willems. But the governor tells us that Jan Willems had come to the West Indies alongside Thomas Paine, and they had been sailing together for some time. But aside from these slim mentions, the record of the actions of these privateers in this part of the war aren't clear. We do know that in April of 1676, George Wright, Thomas Paine, and Jan Willems captured a French bark back from Spanish control. It was a bark that had been captured in the Bay of Biscay, off the coast of La Rochelle, by Spanish Biscayers, then sold in Santo Domingo. But this little buccaneer fleet recaptured her off the Spanish Main. They would have taken her back to Saint-Domingue, but that was an impossibility considering the Armada de Barlovento was sailing around at the time. So instead they traveled to St. Croix, which unfortunately meant they had to give the ship back to France instead of, turning her into a pirate ship. But aside from these brief mentions in the record, there's not a lot to go on. We can guess about some of their actions, but really that would just assume that they may have been involved in the large privateer actions that were taking place at this point in the war. For example, the 1677 raid sent against Venezuela. Now that was a fleet of almost entirely privateers, which really we should read as buccaneers and pirates. But it was led by an admiral and a general who had been sent from the old country to the New World to fight this battle. These were real officers, not buccaneers. And they chose to use military discipline on their men, on the buccaneers, on these brethren of the coast. That means beatings at the mast, which was a large part of why most of the brethren had left naval service in the first place. Those brethren rose up, they mutinied, and very nearly killed those old world commanders before a few of the ringleaders stopped them, saying that this would end poorly for everyone concerned. Instead, they all just got on their ships and left. This large fleet that had been assembled to destroy Venezuela fell apart before even getting halfway there. And then there are the raids of Michel de Gramont. He attacked Cuba more than once. He harried the Spanish fleet off the coast of Santo Domingo, and these are attacks that all of the brethren took part in at some point, but we don't know any specifics about which may have included Jan Willems and Thomas Paine. But you can see the problem here. All of these Englishmen and all of these Dutchmen were sailing for France under French colors and attacking France's enemies, the Spanish. But their own countries, England and the Netherlands, were at peace with Spain. In the case of the Netherlands, they were allied with Spain in the war. It was causing a lot of diplomatic tension. Spain was repeatedly sending emissaries to London and Amsterdam decrying all of the actions of these privateers, but it took 2 years before either England or the Netherlands got around to actually doing anything about it. All of it came to a head in 1678, when England re-entered the conflict, but this time they did so not on the side of France, but on the side of the Dutch, and on the side of their allies, the Spanish. Now, in peacetime, English mariners were more or less welcome to sell their services to whoever they wanted. But when war was joined, it actually still wasn't illegal, but it was very frowned upon to sail for your enemies. Not quite treason, but almost. Later that year, 1678, largely because England joined the war, all of the European powers finally reached a ceasefire agreement. They began their discussions that would lead to a spiderweb of treaties that would be called the Peace of Nijmegen. But this ceasefire, before the treaty was officially sanctioned, stopped the fighting in Europe, but not in the West Indies. If anything, it grew worse in the West Indies because of the ceasefire. Both sides were jockeying for position, trying to get the best diplomatic angle through private military means. They couldn't have their generals leading armies but they could have pirates and privateers who were less controllable, undertaking actions against their not-quite enemies. This state of affairs went on for over a year, and there were a ton of small naval engagements, by which I mean pirates attacking Spanish shipping and the Spanish sinking pirate ships. But finally, word reached the New World that a peace had been reached. Jan Willems was selling yet another Spanish prize at one of the French territories in the Leeward Islands when word reached him there, and the governor there asked Willems to take that news to Santo Domingo and Saint-Domingue. This was a job for which Jan Willems was perfectly suited. He wasn't French or Spanish, but he knew those waters very well, as he had spent years raiding Spanish shipping in them. But more to the point, he spoke Spanish and French and Dutch and English, but that's neither here nor there for this discussion. Still, though, it was a very dangerous mission. I mean, what are you going to do? A man who has just spent years attacking the Spanish out of Santo Domingo? Raise up a white flag and sail into the harbor? Well, that's exactly what he was considering. It seemed to be his best option. How else was he going to get word to Santo Domingo? Jan Willems was weighing his options, anchored off the north coast of Santo Domingo, when that decision was made for him. A few of his men were on shore when a Spanish cavalry contingent arrived on the scene and arrested them. We're talking 80, maybe 100, maybe 150 men, all mounted and heavily armed. And Jan Willems, as he had promised the governor back in the Leeward Islands, had to go ashore to inform them of the peace. I mean, imagine that. He had to row to shore in an open rowboat with maybe a dozen men to face a full Spanish cavalry contingent. Willems, though, was well armed. He had two of the best weapons in the world. He had a white flag and a notice of the peace that had been reached. He did not bring any guns with him. He rowed to shore and informed the commander that the war was finally over. Then he asked the commander to inform his own governor that the governor in Saint-Domingue requested his presence, or the presence of an agent, to formalize their peace as per the Treaty of Nijmegen. And imagine that from the Spanish commander's point of view. You finally have a pirate ship anchored just offshore in your sights. You have a few of their men in your custody just where you want them. You can demand any terms you wish, and then, nope, a treaty has been reached. But he did as asked. He went back to the capital, and the governor sent that same commander to Saint-Domingue. Jan Willems was at that meeting as well. He confirmed that this was the commander who had treated his men well, and had to translate that meeting as he was the only person there who spoke all of the languages necessary. That meeting ended, finally, the last fighting in the Franco-Dutch War. But while that war was over, other conflicts would arise, some official and some not, in which the pirates would have to fight. This gave all of the Brethren of the Coast a chance to take a break. It had been a long time since they'd been able to just relax for once. But then word started trickling in that the Spanish were absolutely furious about the depredations going on in the Pacific. Men were being killed down there. I thought the fighting was over. So it seemed like a good time to make oneself scarce. Those who had the capability decided it was a good opportunity to go on a vacation to somewhere far, far away from any Spanish territory. In late 1680, a ship sailed north from Tortuga, past San Augustine and up the coast. That ship carried, we know, Thomas Paine, although quite possibly, as they disappear from the record for a time as well, Jan Willems and George Wright. In early 1681, it arrived at Plymouth on Cape Cod. This was not a crew of raucous buccaneers arriving in the Puritan city to raise hell. In fact, it was quite the contrary. These were not regular crewmen. These were all officers and trusted men, and maybe some of them with their companions, who were looking for a quiet place to relax, a place to lay low for a while. But not too low. They weren't hiding out. They actually began making something of a splash there in Plymouth. Not a violent or drunken or debaucherous splash, though. Thomas Paine, at least, funded the construction of a windmill. It's the oldest windmill in Massachusetts. Still, today, you can go see it. It's the Eastham Windmill. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's pretty cool. And if you do, it's just a short drive down to the Witta Museum, also on Cape Cod. But building a windmill is not laying low. It's laying down roots. And those roots, well, they proved strong. They would last for Thomas Paine and Jan Willems, even through the storms that were yet to come. Returning to the familiar and comfortable aspects of your past can often serve as a reprieve from the stresses of real life. Like coming home for the summer after your first year of college. All the old comforts are still there. It's just good for the soul. It gives you time to pause and reflect and, most importantly, to relax. However, as we can all attest these days, while spending time in quiet isolation can be a respite, it gets old surprisingly quickly. I don't know about you, but I gave up my definitely gonna stick with it this time meditation and yoga routine in about 2 days. Imagine that you live a life in which you've grown used to the blood and smoke of combat and action, to the tranquility of the open sea, and to the dangers of the open sea. How would you fare giving that up for farming? How do you suppose a pirate fares building a windmill? Thomas Paine did just that in 1680. He returned to Massachusetts Bay and built the oldest surviving windmill in Massachusetts. This would have been a perfect time for him to settle down, to buy a house, and to retire from a life of roving. And maybe it was intended to be, but it wouldn't last. In only a very few short months, Thomas Paine was back in the West Indies and back on the account. This is episode 163, A Race of Evildoers. I suggested last time that it was possible that the pirates George Wright and Jan Willems accompanied Thomas Paine to New England in 1680. And I stick by that. All throughout this story, those 3 captains and their crews proved to be something of a clique within the world of the Brethren of the Coast. Beyond that, they disappear from the historic record at the same time that Captain Paine went to Cape Cod, and all 3 reappear in the West Indies at the same time as Thomas Paine. But that reappearance might just be a coincidence. They could have been spending their war winnings on a weeks-long binge in Tortuga, a bacchanal of rum and wine and beer, surrounded by a haze of opium and marijuana and tobacco smoke. Only interrupted, of course, by marathon bouts of sex and gambling until all of their money and all of their energy was spent. That's what everyone describes whenever a pirate crew gets paid, from the very earliest Buccaneers on down through the end of the 1800s. Those orgies of sinful opulence were the back on which the economies of places like Port Royal and Tortuga and later Nassau were built. That and the provision and sale of illegally obtained goods. And we can assume that many of the crewmen of Jan Willems and George Wright and Thomas Paine were engaging in all of that and more. But as for their captains, well, George Wright and Thomas Paine were a bit older. Paine was at this point nearing 50, and Wright was probably of an age, maybe a bit younger, but nearly as old as Henry Morgan, which would put him in that same general bracket. That might explain why Thomas Paine went to Cape Cod to build a windmill, and it might suggest that Wright would have accompanied him or done something similar about which we don't know. As for Jan Willems, well, he was younger. And when I was younger, that sort of Tortuga excess would have absolutely been the goal whenever I came into a stack of cash. And I'm still not yet at the build a windmill on Cape Cod stage of life, but, a windmill would be kind of cool. That is to say that if any of the three captains we're talking about here did stay in Tortuga, it was probably Jan Willems. However, by early 1681, the windmill was completed, and all three captains were back in the West Indies. We know this because the record that we have briefly shines a bright light on them, thanks to William Dampier. This was nearing the end of the first Pacific adventure. John Coxon had long ago returned to the Caribbean, but John Cook and Edward Davis, William Dampier, and Lionel Wafer, they all split with Bartholomew Sharp and returned across the Isthmus of Panama at Darien. During that crossing, Lionel Wafer was injured while crossing a dangerous river and forced to stay behind with the local Guna or Kuna people with whom the English had an alliance. But when those pirates, the bedraggled and haggard pirates near exhaustion, emerged from the Panamanian jungle to the coast of the Caribbean, they found a ship waiting for them. It was a French pirate vessel under Capitaine Jean Tristan. It was one of the many ships that frequented the coast in this region waiting for the Pacific adventurers to return. And thanks to the Kuna, who kept an open trade and an open eye on the pirates, these Pacific adventurers were reunited, and Captain Tristan ferried the Pacific pirates to their fleet over in the San Blas Islands off the coast of Panama. And that, in the eyes of William Dampier, is where we finally meet up with Thomas Paine and Jan Willems. According to Dampier, the fleet was under Paine's command, and this was a proper Brethren of the Coast pirate fleet. It was a multinational group of men preparing to attack the Spanish in a time of complete peace. There are a number of names that we are familiar with at this meeting place. In addition to Wright and Willems, John Coxon was there. He had joined up with this fleet after returning to the Caribbean. And an old friend of ours named Jean Rose was there as well, among many others. And a few days after the Pacific men arrived, Captain George Wright appeared with a prize in tow. He had a Spanish merchantman carrying flour, probably cornmeal, not wheat flour, but that's exactly what the pirates needed to undertake their raid against the Spanish Main. The captains bought that cornmeal from George Wright, who was, after having stolen it, the rightful owner. Some of them did so on credit, which would come into play later. But John Cook and William Dampier, well, why not let Dampier tell it? He writes, quote, "We that came overland out of the South Seas, being weary of living among the French, desired Captain Wright to fit up his prize, the Tartan, and make a man of war of her for us, which at first he seemed to decline, because he was settled among the French in Hispaniola, and was very well beloved both by the governor of Petit Goave and all the gentry. We told him we would go ashore there, and build canoes to transport ourselves down to the Mosquitoes if he would not entertain us. For privateers are not obliged to any ship, but free to go ashore where they please, or to go in any other ship that will entertain them, only paying for their provision. When Captain Wright saw our resolutions, he agreed with us on condition we should be under his command as one ship's company, to which we unanimously consented." End quote. Dampier is saying that Captain George Wright gave them his ship, his newly captured prize, as long as they agreed to sail under his command, which they did. But what William Dampier was missing here, and what we know thanks to subsequent events, is that Wright was not hesitant to hand over his new ship because he was friends with the French, but because of the delicate political situation with the French. They were ascendant in the world of the Brethren of the Coast, thanks in large part to the actions of the Sieur de Poncet. He was continuing to hand out letters of marque. The English, on the other hand, were discouraging privateering very strenuously. Any English buccaneer that wanted to sail had to defer to the French in all things. And not just the English, but the Dutch as well. They were in the same situation. According to Dampier, Jan Willems sailed under George Wright in the same situation as they now did, quote, because Captain Yankee had no commission and was afraid the French would take away his bark, end quote. When Captain Wright gave John Cook that ship, he showed preference to the English, which was an action that the French in the fleet noted down. But Wright did so with purpose. Cook and Davis and Dampier were planning to make for the coast, the mainland, near the San Blas Islands, and then head up to the Mosquito Coast. But that wasn't a good idea. John Cook and his group didn't know that it was a dangerous stretch of coastline, but Captain Wright did. They would learn, though. William Dampier tells us, quote, the Indians here have no commerce with the Spaniards, but are very barbarous and will not be dealt with. They have destroyed many privateers, as they did not long after this some of Captain Paine's men, who, having built a tent ashore to put his goods in, while he careened his ship, and some men lying there with their arms in the night, the Indians crept softly into the tent and cut off the heads of 3 or 4 men, and made their escape. Nor was this the first time they had served the privateers so. End quote. George Wright saved them from that fate. However, as the fleet departed from the San Blas Islands, preparing to go raid the Spanish, a terrible storm fell on them. The pirate fleet was dispersed. For the following few days, everyone sailed around trying to find anyone they recognized. George Wright, Jan Willems, and John Cook, their 3 vessels, they had all been close together when the storm hit, so they found each other. They reunited. And together they tried to find the others, but after a few days, a couple of weeks even, of sailing around and finding no one, they chose instead to try to find a safe harbor, somewhere, anywhere that would take them in, where they could rest and resupply. That voyage is the story of Betrayal by the French Captain Tristan, who would join them a few days later, in which he attempted to sell the English under John Cook out to the governor of Saint-Domingue, Governor de Cussy. Now, I'm not going to go into that story here. We've talked about it at length already. But the political situation that led to that betrayal is relevant. On their way north from the Spanish Main, the pirate fleet stopped at every potentially friendly port in both the Windward and Leeward Islands. Every Dutch or French or English harbor, like St. Vincent and St. Lucia, Martinique, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts, they still called it St. Christopher, Anguilla, nowhere would take them in. They had bags and bags full of silver. But despite that, or maybe because of it, no one would accept them. No formerly friendly colony would harbor these pirates. They were learning that the tide had turned against piracy by 1681. The greater political landscape worldwide was no longer one of warfare, but one of peaceful trade, and pirates have no place in that world, except as outlaws and miscreants. That's why, after months of searching, they finally sailed for the only friendly harbor in the West Indies, Petit Goave on Saint-Domingue. When they finally elected to make for Petit Goave, George Wright elected not to go, which is a bit surprising. Remember how Dampier said that he was beloved by the governor and had a home there and was friends with all the gentry? Well, that used to be the case, but it wasn't anymore. Wright, because he had been living through the ascension of the French Buccaneers and the political turmoil between England and France, well, he chose to avoid Saint-Domingue. And he warned Cook and Dampier to avoid it as well. He invited them to come to Port Royal. but they ignored his warnings. That decision nearly led to their arrest and execution. Instead, they enacted a bold and daring escape in the middle of the night, but that's not our story today. Instead, I want to stick with George Wright, Jan Willems, and Thomas Paine. George Wright returned to Port Royal, where we will meet him again in a short while. But for now, I want to turn back to Tom Paine. His ship, the St. David, was damaged in the storm that dispersed his fleet. That's why he careened her on the mainland there, and that's when some of his men got their heads chopped off. William Dampier, who didn't know that at the time, would learn it about 2 years later when he returned to the West Indies. Once his ship was seaworthy, John Paine went out searching for the rest of his fleet. And he found a couple of them, including John Coxon, but Jean Rose was still missing. A few days later, though, Jean Rose's ship sailed into view. They set sail to go meet Jean Rose, but shortly after doing so, they saw that he was not alone. As his ship came into view, they saw that he was running as fast as the wind could carry him from a fleet of 12 Spanish man-o'-war. The pirates broke ranks and fled in every direction, which is what you do when 12 warships show up on the scene. That forced the Spanish to make a decision, though. They could split up their forces and chase after all of the pirates. And that might mean that they would catch all of the pirates and have a big old trial which would lead to a hanging for hundreds of buccaneers. But it also means that the pirates might be able to capture one of their warships or more, especially if there were other ships lurking about. Conversely, they could stick together and stay on the one ship that they were already chasing. That would certainly keep their own ships and their own men safe, and it would raise their chances of hanging someone at the end of all of this. So the Spanish stuck together and chased after Jean Rose. As it happened, they never caught him. Jean Rose was a good pirate. They never got to hang anyone, and all of the pirates got away. Everyone laid low for a while. But by early 1682, big events were underway from Tortuga. Michel de Gramont sent out word to Port Royal and Bluefields on the Mosquito Coast, to all of the known pirate haunts. He let them know that he was preparing a major raid. He didn't say where, that might get out, but he told everyone to assemble at Cow Island, off the coast of Saint-Domingue. Nearly everyone sailed to meet that fleet, but not the little clique of George Wright, Jan Willems, and Thomas Paine. Instead, they met off the coast of Jamaica. This major offensive gave them an opportunity to make a final decision about joining the likes of Michel de Gramont and Lauro de Graaf. French service was becoming burdensome, even dangerous for all of them, for everyone who wasn't French. Not only was the job itself dangerous, their rewards in doing so were shrinking. They had to give more and more every year to Monsieur de Cousset. Plus, their own governments were growing less indulgent towards buccaneering. So the two Englishmen, both of whom were getting older, Thomas Paine turned 50 that year, they chose to sail for Port Royal and to throw themselves at the mercy of Admiral Henry Morgan, at this point acting governor. If it's true that they did in fact sail with him against Maracaibo and Panama in 1666 and 1671, there's something almost heartwarming about that potential reunion. But Jan Willems was less likely to find a hospitable welcome in Port Royal. His options were poor, but he chose instead to sail off and join up with Michel de Gramont. Maybe it's because he was younger. He still had that fire for action in the belly. Or maybe it's because he was Dutch and he didn't have any easy home waiting for him besides with the Buccaneers. Or maybe he and the two Englishmen had some sort of falling out, we don't know. But for whatever reason, this appeared to be the end of their partnership. Upon reaching Gramont's rendezvous, Willems discovered that they were planning a massive blockade of Cuba. This action could have been the crowning achievement of the Buccaneers, a raid that would outstrip even Henry Morgan's raid on Panama. It might have showered them in riches and glory for all time. However, The Buccaneers by 1682 were fading. The numbers that Michel de Grammont was able to gather was less than hoped for. They went through with the plan, although scaled back a bit, but even that didn't really last. The Spanish broke their blockade, and the Brethren of the Coast, defeated, returned to Petit Goave in disarray. Michel de Grammont was a beaten man. Jan Willems, though, actually played a role in rallying their flagging spirits. He joined the company of Lauro de Graaf and Michael André Zun and the newly arrived Anne Lavaux. That story, well, we'll return to Jan Willems. For now, the two Englishmen off the coast of Jamaica. They sent some agents to Port Royal to scout out the landscape, which turned out to be a very good decision. Henry Morgan was under a lot of pressure to act against the Buccaneers. It was assumed everywhere from Port Royal to London that he was still at heart a pirate himself. While those agents of Thomas Paine and George Wright were in Port Royal, another English privateer who sailed under French colors arrived at Port Royal. He was probably, very much like Wright and Paine, trying to avoid taking part in the Cuba blockade. However, he was less cautious than the two elder Buccaneers. You don't live to be a 50-year-old pirate by being reckless. Morgan, under that pressure, arrested the Buccaneers that sailed into Port Royal. He put them on trial, and the officers were hanged at Fort Charles. The crewmen were offered pardons, but they had to sign up with the militia. This didn't prove to be a warm welcome for anyone. George Wright and Thomas Paine, taking the hint, sailed away from Jamaica. But they didn't go to join the blockade. Instead, they sailed off to hunt prizes of their own off the coast of Venezuela. One of their first captures was a prize of real significance. They captured an 8-gun Spanish man-of-war, which Thomas Paine took as his own. He named her Pearl. He gave St. David over to George Wright. Later on, they would sell George Wright's old ship to another pirate. But then the two crews scavenged the wreck of an old Spanish warship, a warship in which they were both involved in sinking. Coming here to get those guns may have been their goal all along. They rescued 8 usable big guns and added 4 each to Pearl and St. David. That brought the Pearl to 12 guns and 80 men. Now that they were in a stronger position, they spent the next few months capturing Spanish merchantmen, mostly off the coast of Venezuela. Nothing too valuable, no big hauls, these were not their glory days, but they did engage in a brisk trade in stolen beef and sugar. They had enough to live comfortably and to fill their coffers. But once their cruises there were done, it was time to search out a new home. Once again, they traveled all throughout the Lesser Antilles, looking for somewhere that they might stay, but no one would let them in. Pirates were a liability in this day and age. This left the two old friends and partners in a difficult situation. They had decisions to make. Thomas Paine wanted to make another try for Jamaica. George Wright didn't. It was at this point that they chose to split up amicably, to split their loot, and to go their separate ways. That event is our last known record of Captain George Wright. He sailed off into the mists of history, never to be seen again. But Thomas Paine did return to Jamaica in 1683, and he found the landscape of Port Royal very different than he had left it. Henry Morgan was no longer acting governor. Thomas Lynch, who had served as governor for 2 different terms in the 60s and 70s, was back in. He got the gig by offering King Charles a huge sum of money. It was so much money, in fact, that Sir Thomas Lynch was raised as a Knight of the Garter and admitted as a gentleman of the bedchamber. Then he was sent back to Jamaica to fix the piracy problem and to make it once again a profitable colony. Under Thomas Lynch's leadership, and due to a royal 1683 decree, Port Royal decided to change tack in regard to pirates and piracy. Charles II and the Parliament had, at long last, outlawed the practice of English mariners selling their services to foreign princes. Any who chose to do so would be considered outlaws and prosecuted as pirates to the full extent of the law. Now, I don't know that Thomas Paine heard about this change in policy before deciding to head back to Jamaica. The record suggests that he probably didn't, that he was surprised about it when he returned to Port Royal, but if that's true, this is amazing timing on his part. Governor Lynch, just a few weeks earlier, had laid out a blanket pardon for any pirates who surrendered in Port Royal. This was the sort of pardon that, much like a similar event happening concurrently in New England, didn't look too hard at your coffers. However, you didn't get off scot-free. If you got that pardon, you had to agree to work for a time for the governor. But a lot of pirates took him up on the offer. John Coxon, for example, and Thomas Paine. Both men, among others, were given English commissions, not to attack the Spanish or the French or to engage in any privateering per se, but to, quote, seize, kill, and destroy pirates, end quote. However, if, while you were out there seizing and killing and destroying pirates on the high seas, if some of their treasure happened to fall into your own pockets, nobody would ask too many questions. John Coxon sailed off to the south and west and had a ton of exciting adventures. But Thomas Paine sailed north. His cruises took him to a burgeoning pirate base in the Bahamas. The island, called New Providence Island, was currently under English control, although they had almost no presence there. However, the only settlement on New Providence had been founded some years earlier, by the Dutch, in fact, and named after their Dutch stadholder, William, the third Prince of Orange. It was named after William's estates in Nassau. There at Nassau, Paine caught wind of a group of pirates who, well, this was a taste of things to come. A Spanish treasure ship had recently crashed off the coast of Florida, which was brimming with silver. The pirates were gathering in Nassau to scavenge the bones of that treasure ship. Now, this isn't the Spanish treasure ship brimming with silver that lured all the pirates to Nassau on New Providence. That's 40 years in the future yet. But it was a Spanish treasure ship brimming with silver that lured all the pirates to Nassau. And it proved to be too much for this newly minted pirate hunter. Instead of breaking up the pirates' plan, Thomas Paine sailed off to get a taste. He found the wreck of the treasure ship along with 4 pirate ships that were anchored off the coast. Those ships belonged to Captains Conway Woolley, John Markham, Jan Corneliszun, and Pierre Breha. But those pirates and all of their men were currently ashore. They were engaged in a siege of the Spanish fort at San Augustine. But it was a really bad siege. Not in that it was a bloody and brutal siege. The Spanish weren't busy eating all of their dogs and babies. No, it was a bad siege in that the pirates didn't know how to conduct a siege very well. They were on the verge of falling apart under the pressure of regular Spanish cavalry sorties. These pirates were not prepared or experienced enough to attack a fort like San Augustine. But a veteran like Thomas Paine very much was. His men disembarked and marched on San Augustine. They were well-armed, well-trained, well-fed, and immediately they turned the tide of the battle. The Spanish governor there, after their inevitable defeat, wrote to Havana and explained that they were on the verge of victory when the corsario Thomas de la Pina arrived and ruined everything. Due to his intervention, the pirates won the day. But then comes my favorite bit of this whole story. Thomas de la Pina was a gracious commander. He realized that the other pirates had a better claim to this treasure He merely saw his fellow brethren in need and came in to save the day. So he let them have San Augustine. He left them there to ransack it. It's yours for the taking, boys, have at it. Meantime, though, Thomas Paine returned to the treasure ship and loaded up on silver. I mean a lot of silver. So much that he had to commandeer Pierre Breha's ship to carry it all. That's the kind of booty on which a man could retire. And with his holds full of Spanish treasure, he sailed north. Just in time, too. The governor of New Providence did manage to cobble together a flota and sent it off to arrest the pirates. And when he got there, he found 4 pirate captains with 3 ships between them and a wrecked treasure ship nearly empty of silver. Thomas Paine was nowhere to be found. By that time, he was well on his way to Providence, Rhode Island. The governor of the colony at New Hampshire, Edward Cranfield, was visiting Providence, Rhode Island when Thomas Paine arrived. Cranfield was a notorious busybody, and as governor of a territory that had no access to the sea, he frowned upon piracy. He wrote back to London, quote, "During my stay at Rhode Island, 2 pirates came in. Paine was one of them, with a counterfeit commission from Sir Thomas Lynch, styling him one of the gentlemen of the king's bedchamber, whereby I knew it to be forged. Colonel Dongan and I asked the government to arrest them, but they refused." End quote. You'll note that his complaint that the letter of marque was a forgery was based on flawed information. Thomas Lynch was a gentleman of the king's bedchamber, and that letter of marque was legitimate. That's why Paine managed to get off the hook. Plus, his holds were full of Spanish silver, much of which he paid for his docking fees, and was sent off to be minted into pine tree shillings at Boston's Silver Mint. Thomas Paine's salvage operation was causing a lot of diplomatic trouble, though. The Spanish ambassador in London was sent before King Charles II to lodge many complaints, and they turned out to be quite forceful. So Charles II, King of England, issued a notice on April 13th, 1684, from Windsor Castle to the governors of all New England that specifically called out Thomas Paine. That decree instructed the governors, in regard to what the king called in the most wonderful language, quote, "a race of evildoers and enemies of mankind," end quote. It ordered the governors to, quote, "permit no succor nor retreat to be given to any pirates, least of all to Thomas Paine, who with 5 vessels under Breha, a Frenchman, is lately arrived at Florida." End quote. The Rhode Island governor was forced to haul Thomas Paine before a council of notables that included himself, the governor of New York, the governor of New Hampshire, Cranfield, as well as an agent from Boston that served the lords of trade and plantations. Cranfield again levied his accusations of forgery, stating that the letter of marque was not even in Thomas Lynch's handwriting. The governor of Rhode Island disagreed with his assessment, though. Cranfield claimed that the Rhode Island governor refused to, quote, "see with eyes like other men," end quote. And the letter of marque probably wasn't in Lynch's handwriting. It was probably transcribed by someone else. But the agent from Boston upheld the decision of the governor of Rhode Island, which, as we know, was the correct one. However, I doubt it mattered very much whether the letter of marque was legitimate or not. Boston, thanks to Thomas Lynch, was seeing this flood of silver like never before come out of its silver mint. I will remind you that silver mint existed in Boston despite Massachusetts not having one single silver mine. Thomas Paine, once and for all, for now, went free. Apparently all you needed was enough silver to buy your innocence. This decision, though, in the long run, would prove fortuitous for the people of New England. In the war that was to come, Thomas Paine would come out of retirement. He would use all of his skills and his influence in the world of the pirates in the defense of the New Englanders, when he sailed alongside none other than Captain William Kidd. The Barbary corsairs are a topic that we have criminally neglected here on the Pirate History Podcast. And we're not going to rectify that today, but I do want you to keep it in the back of your mind that they're always out there, in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coastal waters, preying primarily on European shipping. We've talked about the height of the Barbary pirates, the brothers Barbarossa, and of course John Ward and Simon Danziger, but they were around far before Columbus ever sailed for America, and they're going to continue to be a problem long after the golden age of piracy is ended. While we in the U.S. often overlook Barbary pirates, the Caribbean pirates are so much more fun, the Barbary pirates do hold a special place in the European mind. A capture by Barbary pirates was a sentence of lifelong slavery. The only way out was to buy your freedom, and unless you or your family was independently wealthy, there wasn't a lot of hope. One or two popes did get involved when high-ranking church officials were captured, and there were monasteries in Italy, France, and Spain that did raise funds to buy back Barbary captives. But for the most part, you were a slave. Very occasionally, powerful states with large navies would get involved when the Barbary pirates became a real concern. But it wasn't an act of humanitarianism. No, they did it when their nation's prestige was on the line, when enough of a certain country's native sons were sailing out of the Barbary coast, enough of them that it got noticed. For the English and the Dutch, though, this was becoming a common affair in the 1600s. Every time they would have a war and employ thousands of privateers, they would then end the war, and they would threaten to execute any of those privateers who continued the trade as pirates. Inevitably, a host of unrepentant privateers would sail for North Africa, where they could stay on the account. Equally reliably, England or the Netherlands would eventually have to send a fleet to Africa to deal with the problem. In 1675, following the most recent war, England sent Admiral Sir John Narborough to deal with the problem of Tunis and Tripoli. But you all remember Sir John Narborough, right? He was a prominent admiral in the 17th century. He was the man that sailed an English fleet to Patagonia and then on to Lima in Peru. He attempted to negotiate a trade treaty with the Spanish there. I postulated long ago that this voyage under Admiral Narborough may have instigated the interest in the Pacific coast of South America. It may have been the impetus for some of those backroom deals in the English court that led us to the Pacific adventure. John Narborough is all over our story, though. Usually not dealing with pirates. He's busy winning great naval battles and honor and prestige. But his Barbary trip in 1675 is a perfect example of English diplomacy at the time. He sailed in intending to make a deal, but before even attempting to do so, he bombarded Tunis and Tripoli with all of his guns until they were ready to sign a lasting treaty with England. Algiers was a problem as well, but that was a French problem. However, those three cities were responsible for almost all of the Barbary piracy in the Mediterranean. But then, once, thanks to John Narborough, they were brought to heel, the pirates living in those cities had to find another locale, a new base, and they fled to an old favorite, the Moroccan port near the Atlantic coast of Salé. The English and the Dutch were well acquainted with the Salé rovers. They had been ever since Jan Janssen established the base in 1615. Still, when King Charles II of England was pushed by international pressure and the scourge of piracy to make a declaration against English pirates living in Boston and Providence and Port Royal and the other Providence, it was his brother, James, the Lord High Admiral, that was sent out to deal with the Salé rovers. In one of his last voyages as Lord High Admiral, James Stewart sent a fleet to Salé to root the pirates out of their bases and break their backs. Now, this was a relatively small naval action in terms of the great battles that we've seen in the wars and will see in the wars to come. But in terms of ramifications to our story, it's huge in a host of different ways. Remember, this attack on Salé, we will be referring to it again and again. Today, though, that raid on Salé has one very notable outcome. The English fleet captured several ships, but one of them was a powerful man-o'-war. We don't know what her name was at the time, but the English called her Sally Rose. I like to imagine that that's a nod to her red standard, the Sally Rouge that was flown by the pirates out of Morocco. The Sally Rose was sailed back to England and converted into a sixth-rate, 16-gun ship of the line, and rechristened officially the HMS Rose. She, like some of the other ships taken there at Salé, was given into the command of a new captain, a promising young up-and-comer in the Royal Navy. That captain sailed Sally Rose to Boston, where she would patrol New England's coastal waters. Her captain was a good, patriotic, loyal kingsman named Thomas Paine. This is episode 164. Thomas Paine. Part 1. The King of England, Charles, was in need of good, loyal, honest men. Really, his brother, the Lord High Admiral James, Duke of York, he was in need of good, loyal men. King Charles' health was failing by the time of that attack on Salé, and James was in line to take the throne. As he was Lord High Admiral, he was in a position to fill the ranks of the Navy with the best of the best as far as he was concerned, with men he could trust. Now that was a project of years, and by the time he eventually did take the throne of England, the Navy was in, as James saw it, very good hands. Thomas Paine was one of those men, the kind of captain who loved the king and kept an eye on those Puritan Bostonians as much as he did the enemy. You know, whoever the enemy might be at the time, and at this point, that included almost everyone, even presumably, in some eyes, the people of Boston. Today, I would like to look at pirate history in the mid-1680s through the eyes of Thomas Paine. He and Sally Rose patrolled the coast of New England for smugglers and pirates, and, of course, the Dutch. Everyone was on high alert for Dutch incursions. There were a ton of tensions between England and the Netherlands, and we will get to those, but that's not the crux of today's show. Plus, Thomas Paine's primary job appears to have been hunting pirates. Now, this may just have been a symptom of the era in which he sailed for the Navy, an era in which there were a ton of pirates in New England. And then King Charles promulgated those edicts, which gave the Navy men a bunch of extra work hunting down pirates. And then, of course, there were all of those smaller royal notices, like one we talked about last time concerning Thomas Paine. The Sally Rose is an excellent source for what was going on in terms of piracy in New England. We have records of what she was up to most of the time. Sir Edmund Andros, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, mobilized Sally Rose against a number of high-profile pirate threats. For example, in 1683, Sally Rose was dispatched to Chesapeake Bay and the Virginia colony because of a rumor that John Cook and Edward Davis had been spotted in Virginia. As it happens, they were in Virginia. They were there to pick up William Dampier. Of course, by the time the Sally Rose arrived in Virginia, the pirates were long gone. They were already well on their way to Africa, where they would capture the Bachelor's Delight, and then head off to the Pacific to finish the job started by Admiral Narborough. However, upon his arrival in Virginia, Captain Thomas Paine was encouraged to stay in the Chesapeake for a few months longer. There was, at that point, an even greater pirate menace than John Cook and Edward Davis. Perhaps the greatest threat currently active in the West Indies, a man named Capitan Jean Hamlin. Hamlin was a really scary pirate, in part because, unlike many of our characters so far, he was a real pirate, a man with no allegiances and no honor, not even to his comrades. Naturally, he captured Spanish and Portuguese shipping, as well as the English. He also captured shipping out of France, his home country, and perhaps most surprisingly, he captured a number of Dutch ships in his time. Which is surprising because his patron was a Dutch rogue governor of St. Thomas named Adolf Esmet. Hamlin captured merchantmen and naval vessels and even, on occasion, pirate ships. His greatest prize, arguably, was a ship known as La Trampeuse, or the Trickster, a 30-gun Royal French merchant vessel. In 1682, Trampeuse was sent from France to Port Royal, Jamaica, under a captain named Pierre Le Pain. Every pirate in the West Indies saw this 30-gun Royal merchantman and began sniffing after her, which makes it, to my mind, a bit suspicious that Pierre Le Pain chose to settle down there in Port Royal and sent his ship, the Trampeuse, off to pick up logwood in Campeche for the journey home. Inevitably, La Trampeuse was captured by 120, quote, desperate rogues. Now, who those rogues were isn't exactly clear. There are French and English and Dutch records that all tell different stories about what pirates were where at the time. The record appears to be clear that whoever captured the Trampeuse were French, but that's where the conjecture begins. The English blamed an up-and-coming pirate, Lauro de Graaf, but Michel de Gramont, Jean Rose, and Jan Willems, well, they were all tossed onto the pile as possibilities as well, or perhaps accomplices. However, all of those pirates had alibis. Of course, those alibis were from the French governor and Petit Goave, so the English didn't exactly believe them. The record is confused on this point, but it was probably Jean Hamlin. His name wasn't yet known to the authorities, so when the English began speculating, they would not have guessed it was Hamlin. However, even if he didn't initially capture La Trampeuse, he did capture her from whoever did before long. Over the next few months, Hamlin and La Trampeuse engaged in a campaign of terror in the Windward Passage and on the coast of the Yucatan. 18 ships fell to Jean Hamlin, nearly all of them out of Port Royal. That's when Governor Lynch and Henry Morgan started handing out commissions to the likes of Thomas Paine and John Coxon. Their job was to hunt Jean Hamlin down. They offered Jan Willems a commission as well, but Willems was busy in Mexico. That threat, the threat of Jean Hamlin, is why Thomas Pound was in Chesapeake Bay at the time. Now, they didn't expect Jean Hamlin to venture north to North America. However, Chesapeake Bay was the best location that the English had in North America to muster a fleet should that happen, or should their West Indian allies need assistance. Of course, no one in the Chesapeake ever even sniffed Jean Hamlin, who, after a few weeks, ran off to Africa. But Sally Rose returned to her base in New England just in time to greet another man, one of those who had been tasked with hunting Hamlin down, Thomas Paine. Now, as we discussed last time, Thomas Paine was welcomed in Rhode Island, but he was still under suspicion. The governors of the Council of New England considered him enough of a menace, if not a threat, that the Sally Rose hung around looking threatening just in case Thomas Paine pulled any dirty tricks or had some friends waiting in the wings. Now, of course, Paine didn't, and eventually Thomas Pound returned to Boston and his regular patrol route. He was sailing the Nantucket Sound, just off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, when another pirate, an associate of Thomas Paine's and, at one point, Jean Hamlin's, arrived in 1684. Jan Willems. A little background on what Jan Willems had been up to. After he parted ways with George Wright and Thomas Paine a couple of years earlier, he joined up with the Tortuga Buccaneers under Michel de Gramont. He joined in on that ultimately failed attempt at a Cuban blockade in 1682. But Jan Willems rallied the troops, and in November 1683, he and Nicholas von Horn and Lauro de Graaf and Michael André Zune led what really is the last great raid of the Buccaneer era. They attacked Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a big, profitable pirate action that enriched all 800 buccaneers involved, but it also put a price on their heads. After the raid on Veracruz, in a time of peace, Spain was out for blood, pirate blood. The pirates and a Spanish armada fought a serious naval engagement just outside of Cartagena around Christmas, 1683. So the fleet, the pirate fleet, dispersed. Pirates roved all over the world. Now, who all was there at Veracruz we can't say for certain. The names we just mentioned were there, of course, but there were 800 other pirates. We can, however, make some educated guesses about names that would shortly become notable who may have been there. And, for the most part, these are guesses. Some of them are probable guesses, even likely guesses, but some of them less so. The French pirates that were about to cross the Isthmus of Panama and join the likes of John Cook and Charles Swan and William Dampier on the second Pacific adventure, well, they were probably running from the fury of the Windward Fleet in the West Indies. That means Francois Groenet, Francis Townley, Mathurin des Marais, Pierre Le Picard, even George Dew, and of course Peter Harris the Younger. They all very likely participated in the raid on Veracruz. However, our record of their actions begins in 1685, when Ravenel de Lussan joined them and started writing things down, also when they joined up with William Dampier. So we couldn't say for sure if they were at Veracruz, but it's almost certain that that was the case. Then there were a few pirates who had previously served under Jean Hamlin, but after Hamlin ran off for Africa, they joined up with Jan Willems. Those are names that we will be discussing in much more detail in the very near future, names like Jean Fantin, Jacob Evertson, and George Peterson. But then I want to toss out a couple of unlikely possibilities. Unlikely, but possible. The first pirate who may have been at Veracruz, or at least could have been, is a Scotsman. After coming to America, he settled in New York once England took it over, and he's rumored at one point to have been serving with some West Indian pirates around this time. William Kidd, not yet Captain Kidd, just William, could have been at Veracruz. If he was, he could have sailed under Jan Willems, and if that's the case, it's very probable that he would have returned to New England in 1684. Now, it's much more likely that William Kidd wasn't at Veracruz, which we'll return to in just a second, but first, the other unlikely pirate who could have been at Veracruz. Henry Avery, also known as Henry Avery, or Long Ben, or Benjamin Bridgman. Well, he's something of a ghost in the record. The myths and the legends that surround his life before turning to piracy are legion. And I should say they're all disreputable. Now, we're going to talk at great length about Henry Avery in the near future, and the many, many myths that surround his life. But there are those who would suggest, probably erroneously, that Henry Avery was a pirate already here in the early 1680s. Now, those who would make that suggestion would almost certainly be wrong, but I do want to mention the possibility. I can say, though, that it's highly unlikely. The only hard facts we have about Henry Avery's early life come from the Royal Navy. Henry Avery, like Thomas Paine, was a navyman, a Royal Navyman. And I should note that the record of his time in the Navy uses both the spellings of Avery and Every. They're the same person, but I'm going to choose to call him Avery moving forward. Henry Avery, we know, sailed in at least 2 fleets commanded by none other than the Lord High Admiral James Stewart. The first of those fleets sailed for the Dutch East Indies and fought the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War over in Asia, and Avery wasn't the only pirate there, serving under, and I should say far, far under, James Stewart. The second time, though, that Avery served under James Stewart was when the Lord High Admiral sailed for the Mediterranean. That fleet, one unit of that fleet at least, James was nowhere to be seen at the time, but a unit of that Royal Navy fleet sailed for the Moroccan coast and the pirate port at Salé. That's when the Salé Rose was captured and the Salé rovers broken. It's possible that Thomas Pound, loyal Royal Navyman, knew Henry Avery, also a loyal Royal Navyman. It's even possible, though if this were the case it probably would have made it into the record, but it's possible that Henry Avery himself served on board Salé Rose under Captain Thomas Pound. Now, I don't know that that's the case. Don't go putting that in any papers. These are all guesses of what could have been. What we do know, much more reliably, according to the record, is what a famous pirate in 1684, Jan Willems, was up to after the raid on Veracruz. He sailed north for New England and was spotted near Martha's Vineyard in the Nantucket Sound by Thomas Pound and the Salé Rose. I like to imagine, given the geography here, that Jan Willems had sailed first to Providence, Rhode Island, to visit his old friend Thomas Paine. And I should note that, if that were the case, it's possible that at this point Jan Willems was introduced to a young Scotsman with an interest in the sea rover's life who had been living in New York named William Kidd. That is, of course, if Kidd was not at Veracruz, and I think if either of these possibilities have any truth at all, the second is more likely. If William Kidd did indeed sail with a West Indian pirate in the mid-1680s, it's probable that it began here with Jan Willems' visit to New England. It would be at least a very good opportunity for Kidd to meet one of the most notorious buccaneers of the 17th century, while living at his home in New England. What we do know, we know thanks to the governor of New Hampshire, Edward Cranfield. Of course, you'll remember Edward Cranfield from his moralistic declamations against Thomas Paine from last time. He was that busybody governor with no access to the sea who made justified but factually inaccurate claims against Thomas Paine. Well, when Jan Willems arrived in New England, Cranfield was at it again. He wrote, quote, "A French privateer of 35 guns has arrived at Boston. I am credibly informed that they share 700 pounds sterling a man. The Bostoners no sooner heard of her off the coast than they dispatched a messenger and pilot to convey her into port in defiance of the king's proclamation. The pirates are likely to leave the greatest part of their plate behind, having bought up most of the choice goods in Boston. The ship is now fitting for another expedition." End quote. Now that ship was not Jan Willems. That was in fact Michael André Zune on board his ship La Moutine. They called it the Francesca, which was her original name. Now André Zune had also been at Veracruz and was, after a few days, followed by Jan Willems, who was at the time being shadowed by Thomas Pound and the Salé Rose. Now Pound called Willems' ship the Dolphin, but it was in fact the Dauphin. This is a mistake that we see over and over again. La Moutine, André Zune's ship, was being repaired by the shipwrights in Boston when the authorities decided that Cranfield may have been onto something, and due to the king's declaration, it was probably best to cover their bases and to arrest Michael André Zune. He and his men were detained. His vessel, La Moutine, was impounded, and Jan Willems, who was still at sea, took the opportunity to run. He got out of there as fast as possible. The Salé Rose and Captain Pound pursued Jan Willems until he and his men were well out of New England waters. Once they felt it was safe, Salé Rose returned to Boston, but by that time, a couple of weeks later, Michael André Zune had been released by the authorities there. He had produced sufficient evidence that he had a commission from the governor of Petit Goave. And it's notable here that both Michael André Zune and Jan Willems, though they were sailing for the French, were Dutchmen. Now, I'm going to save all of this political stuff for next time, but remember that at this moment England and the Netherlands were at odds. This wasn't out of the ordinary. They were usually at odds, but during this period, William, the third Prince of Orange, and the House of Stuart in England were engaged in a war of words, a war that would soon blossom into a war of, fighting. The French were, however, respected and shown deference even in English society, at least officially, from the king. So when these Dutchmen, who were under suspicion, produced papers from the French governor, they were allowed to roam free. This was going to be consequential later on, but it was not at this moment of concern to the governor of Massachusetts, nor to the loyal king's man Thomas Paine. New England had other problems. They were about to have a spate of localized piracy. Mostly they were small-timers, none of the big names. A few of them really did fit the mold of pirates perfectly, at least according to the records we have. They blasted into town, bragging about their massive hauls and causing a ruckus, which naturally led to them facing the gallows. A few of those even indulged in that old English medieval tradition of the finest highwaymen and rogues of japing at the crowd at their own execution, mocking the men, flirting with the women, insinuating that he may have had a good time with the governor's wife, that sort of thing. And it's worth asking whether or not those pirates, well, maybe they were perfectly good at the job. Capturing hulls of rich cargo, fencing it at the nearest friendly-ish town, and drinking away their winnings with women who would surely rob them of anything they hadn't already spent. Maybe, though, they aren't remembered or famous names because the English became so efficient during this period at hunting the pirates down. But a few names do stand out. The first of these was a pirate named Captain Graham. Now I say Captain Graham because I'm an American, but it should probably rightly be pronounced Captain Graham. It's even occasionally spelled Graham to reflect the English pronunciation. However, I'm not going to give Captain Graham his first name, because there may be two pirate Captains Graham. The first Captain Graham captured a sloop sailing out of Port Royal. He sent the crew back to Jamaica on board his small bark. In a letter of 20th June, 1684, Governor Thomas Lynch wrote of this pirate crew, quote, "Many of the men are of this island, of Jamaica, but the chief pirate, Graham, is not. It is said that they mean to sail for the South Sea." End quote. Now, we don't know what happened to that ship. Maybe they did, in fact, make it to the South Sea, or maybe not. That same year, in 1684, a crewman named Robert Dangerfield gave a deposition in the Carolina colony. He alleged that his ship, a privateer out of Port Royal under Captain Jeremy Rindell, had been overthrown by the ship's doctor, a man named John Graham. Now that was likely the same chief pirate, Graham, but not definitively. That deposition was not so much concerned with the pirates, but with the marooning that the officers endured. It said that they were left, quote, "upon an island, giving them a turtle net and a canoe, the said island not being inhabited and about 10 leagues from the main or any other inhabited place." End quote. It followed up with the pirate ship saying, quote, "Thence they sailed for Virginia and New England, thence to the Guinea coast, and back to Carolina, where she was wrecked." End quote. After that wreck, some of the crew were arrested and imprisoned, a few of them executed, but Captain Graham got away. He appears next off the coast of Nantucket in command of a 14-gun sloop in the company of another pirate, the other significant name in the New England colonies at this time, a man named Captain Veal. Now, we shouldn't confuse this Captain Veal with Thomas Veal, who was a pirate that operated out of Boston in the 1650s. That Thomas Veal is almost legendary, and the search for his treasure goes on to this very day. This two-ship fleet of Captains Veal and Graham captured a number of ships out of New England, but they weren't terribly consequential, except perhaps in one way. At this moment, in 1685, Jean Hamlin reappeared in the West Indies. He first appeared for a moment off the coast of Brazil, but then, like a firebolt, he was back. He was on board a new ship, La Nouveau Trampeuse. That ship is said to have originated in New England, but the details of how it got into the hands of a French pirate who had been nowhere near New England, well, they're sketchy. It's likely that another pirate captured her and either sold or lost her to the French pirate. That could have been Captain Graham and Captain Veal. The timeline works out. They disappeared from New England shortly before Jean Hamlin reappeared in the West Indies on board his new ship. But despite all of this piracy occurring off the coast of New England, Sally Rose and her captain, Thomas Paine, good king's man, were not sent out after Captains Graham and Veal. No, Captain Paine had a bigger concern. There was another pirate named George Peterson who has been there for everything today. He was at the raid on Veracruz. He was likely even at the blockade of Cuba in 1682. Peterson had been a crewman for Jean Hamlin on his first cruise and then went on to work for Jan Willems. In 1686, George Peterson appeared in Newport, Rhode Island, with valuable cargo to sell. That's why we know much about him at all. The cargo he carried was of much interest to the people of New England. We're talking about elephant husks and rare hides and at least 2 Spanish prize ships. Now, Captain Peterson sold much of his cargo and sailed away with empty holds and a full purse. But HMS Rose was sent out from Boston to chase him down. Captain Paine didn't reach the Nantucket Sound in time to intercept Peterson, but he did have a second chance. 2 years later, in May of 1688, George Peterson was spotted off of Martha's Vineyard. Thomas Paine was closer this time and sailed out to capture him. And here in 1688, he reached the scene in time. Peterson attempted to flee the Sally Rose, but the Rose had the wind and caught up with the pirate ship. This is a bad situation for any pirate to find themselves in, squarely in the sights of a Royal Navy vessel. Peterson turned to fight, but continued attempting to catch the wind and get away, and what resulted was a running battle that lasted for several hours. And pirates were excellent at this sort of combat. It's in fact what they were best at, aside from perhaps boarding. But the Rose had the wind, and the guns, and the manpower, and eventually scored a direct hit on Peterson's ship, damaging the masts and the rigging and piercing the hull. The pirates were going nowhere, except down. But that is a dangerous situation. For the pirates, obviously, they were sinking, but for the HMS Rose as well. Now that the pirates had nothing left to lose, they were able to open up with everything they had on the Rose. They bombarded her as they sank and did a significant amount of damage. The HMS Rose was severely damaged. Not damaged beyond repair, they did sell the ship, but too damaged to continue being a part of the Royal Navy. However, for his valor in battle against the pirates, the good king's man, Thomas Paine, was given a new command. The colonies of New England came together and raised a levy to buy him a new ship that they called the Mary. That name, Mary, turned out to be a harbinger of things to come here in July of 1688. Captain Thomas Paine, loyal, good king's man and naval captain, would hold his position for only 4 months. In November of 1688, England and her colonies suffered a political tidal wave in the Glorious Revolution. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who helps to support the show, all of our patrons on Patreon, all of you new patrons, and I'd like to apologize to Skipper. I'm certain that my birthday wishes came late, but I can only blame our recording schedule and release dates around here. However, I hope you had a fantastic birthday. I'd also like to thank everybody who donates to the show through the website, and everybody who has left us ratings or reviews wherever it is you listen to the show. All of you who have gone over to our YouTube page to subscribe and like the videos and do all the things you're supposed to do on YouTube, and those of you who have done the same things wherever you listen to the show. Everybody who has recommended this show, and even though I'm not very active on places like Twitter, I do see your recommendations and love them, and thank you. Recently, I saw one of you engaged in a conversation about gay history involving the pirates, and thanks for the shout-out, but I'm angry at you for stealing a line that I was not clever enough to have thought of. Talking about pirates not having written down their innermost thoughts and feelings, saying things like, and I quote this Twitter user, "I love two things, kissing men and robbing Spain." It was great. Our theme music, as always, is The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, I mean, come on, what are you doing with your life? You can find them at brillig.com.au, that's BRILLIG.com.au. After you're done over there, you can find us at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.